I would like to start out just by sharing my contact information, telling folks a little bit about who I am. My name is Mitchel Sellers. I run a company called IowaComputerGurus, based here in the Des Moines, Iowa area, although we service a customer base all over the world. I'm a Microsoft MVP. All of my contact information is out here. My GitHub repo or a GitHub profile. There is going to be a GitHub repository, as well as these slides are out in that same repository with a demo that contains all of this. So the overall process here is to make sure that we get something that's practical for you to be able to use and utilize within your organization right away. The goal here is not to go deep into the weeds about logging implementation, but to talk about things in a more practical manner around the things that impact each of us as developers, whether we're brand new to .NET, whether we are, doing something for, we've been doing it for years and we just didn't know why something didn't work. And that's kind of the goal with everything here. So where are we going to be focusing that energy? Well, we're going to take a look at what we can do or what logging can't solve for your particular organization. We're going to look at escalation protocols as it relates to logging and the things that you may want to do, things that you may want to consider not doing within your specific organizations, and things that I've seen or interacted with that maybe have caused good or bad things to happen in the past. We'll talk a little bit about logging sensitivity, which really kind of goes to the escalation protocol process. And then really we're going to take a deep dive in understanding how logging works in .NET Core. And this is one of the areas that I think is most important for developers to understand, because a lot of times when we talk about logging, we think about, well, okay, it's just log messages that we write. In .NET Core, it's far more than that, right? We get access to things, we get access to information that we may never have thought we could easily get. Things like entity framework query performance, entity framework query execution. Why did ASP.NET do what it did and not find your route? Why did your application fail to start? Oh, it's because you forgot to register a certain dependency. Well, let's get those error messages and make sure that we're able to debug that without having to go to the extent of, undoing everything or modifying a web config file and doing all kinds of things in real life. So with that, we've got lots of code samples. And the idea behind the code samples that I have with you is it's a basic ASP.NET Core application that was built off of the regular template from Microsoft. And that template then was updated to add logging. So what you're able to do is if you go and look at the source repository, if you're brand new to .NET Core or ASP.NET Core and you want to kind of look at what was done, you can go back through and look at the individual commit history to see how things were integrated. I'll talk through a little bit of that today here as well. But the goal is to give you something that's the minimum example so that you can go back and then do some diagnostics and play with things on your own to see how everything works within the application, within the process. So people always ask me, well, why do I talk about logging? And for me, it's one of those things that as I look at logging, it's often forgotten. And when I say forgotten, I'm not just talking about the developer productivity side of things. I'm not just talking about the fact that when your life goes sideways and you need log entries, people don't even think about the fact that we may have information there. I do a lot of talks on security, and it's kind of interesting that logging or lack of management of logging falls into two of the top 10 OWASP categories. If you look at the most, the current version of the OWASP recommendations. For those of you that aren't familiar with OWASP, it's basically a list of common security vulnerabilities or the top 10 items that impact web applications today. And the two that I like to focus on here from a logging perspective is broken access control. And people always ask me, well, why or how is broken access control reflected in login? And typically we see it in one of two ways. We see broken access control being part of logging in a situation where somebody can see the logs that shouldn't be able to see the logs, or you're retaining logs longer than you should be, or we're not taking into account or logging critical actions, so then we can't do other things. And then that leads directly into insufficient logging and monitoring. So the idea is that we might have log files, but we really should be looking at those. We should be doing something with those logs. We should be making sure that we know, hey, this is normal, this is abnormal. Are we actually logging the things that matter? And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. So now, I also like talking about this because there's so many ways to go about logging. I'm going to talk today specifically about the use of an open source collection of utilities called Serilog. And Serilog can be used to aggregate and obtain the log messages and put them wherever you want them to be. Now, you can put those to a commercial product known as Seek, which is offered by the makers of the open source projects, but you can also send it to anywhere else. Name your individual environment, and it is probably supported as part of the Serilog integration. And the idea here is that there isn't just a way. I can't tell you, oh, you're building a .NET Core application, do this. I want to get people thinking about, what do you need to do? And I find that it's really important that we do this because, most importantly, the out-of-the-box implementation from Microsoft really, truly leaves us asking a bunch of questions. You have a login configuration in every single .NET Core application you spin up. It's in your app settings JSON. But so many people don't even understand what that login does, because where does it go? How do I configure it? Oh, I want this to go to a file. Can I do that? And the answer is no, you can't, not with the out-of-the-box implementation. So what we get from Microsoft and the guidance that we get isn't necessarily a complete solution. So we have to take those extra couple of steps to beef things up on our side. So that's the reason why I like to step into this. And I always like to start out by asking each of you to just think about a couple of questions in relation to your application today. First of all, do you actively include logging in your code today? Just be thinking about the things that we talk about a little bit later, and things that you might be able to do to make your life a little bit easier if you did potentially include logging in your day-to-day code. If you do have logging, do you have a documented escalation process? So if you have logs and those logs allow you to write out things like warnings and errors, do you have some sort of a process to get those entries to somebody that cares? Regardless of that escalation process, do you look at your logs, and how often do you look at them? So this is something that I find really, really important to remind people, and that is, if you have logs, you need to look at your logs. If you look at your logs, you also need to then look at your retention policies, your compliance rules, and anything that might be related to that, because you want to make sure that your applications are doing and interacting with things in the way that they should. So being able to be aware of what you're doing and what those frequencies are, whether it's a monthly review, quarterly review, I don't really care. But know when you're doing things to look at what your logs are having. The number one thing that I hate is when I go and step into somebody's project and I go out and I find a log directory that has 5 years worth of log data. It's not practical. There's most likely information in there that shouldn't be there. And it's something that we have to kind of take a step back and really look at. So when we talk about logging, and we talk about these things that we're keeping track of, what kinds of things are we tracking? What kinds of things can we do with logging? Where would I say, hey, you can do this with a logging implementation? So diagnostic information is one of the most common things, right? Debug style messages. started this method, exited this method, etc. Things that you saw from example with the Metalogma examples or otherwise. Oftentimes we use those in lower level environments where it's more critical in those lower level environments. Another thing that folks often forget is audit style information. So these would be things like tracking a user's progression, a user's actions through your application. This would be things like critical path items or sensitive data access. Oh, the user purged the cache. The user's accessing administrative settings. The user did something like this, or even credit card transaction logging. This, a transaction was made with this ID from this IP address. Now, it's important. We don't want to put the critical stuff in our logs, right? We don't want to put the credit card number in our logs. Please don't do that. But the idea here is that we often can use logging as a way to create breadcrumbs through our systems to be able to understand what did a user do? What was their timetable? How were they interacting with our application? Because we may need to go back later and figure out what they were doing or why they were doing it. The two best examples I have of that is credit card transactions, right? Logging the IP address and things like that of where the user came, aside from privacy concerns with GDPR or otherwise, if you're an international organization, you want to be able to know, hey, this credit card was sent to us from this location. We've successfully used that in the past to catch fraudulent activity based on the IP address where things came out of. Another thing to look at is just being able to see what was a user doing before they encountered an error, if you're able to follow the user's progression. If we look at what happens behind the scenes, ASP.NET Identity, for example, believes that it's important enough to log as a warning anytime that a user puts in their password incorrectly. If the user gets locked out of their account, that kind of information is what Microsoft is even logging as a warning level event. So be thinking about those kinds of things and things where you might want to be able to audit that progression of your application, specific user actions, or otherwise. And then lastly, exception reporting. This is one of those areas where if you get a logging system in place and you log exceptions and you have an escalation protocol, it's a way for you to be able to know that your application has a critical issue, and you may be able to be proactive, and you can start validation of those errors before you even get a user report. This is something that's been able to be very successful for us to know, hey, this happened. And by the time the client got around to sending us an email saying, hey, I clicked on this thing yesterday and I got an error, the fact that you can go out and actually see what they were doing, see what their error message was, makes it so that you can fix it and give them a much better user experience. So definitely some things that we can do to make our stuff actionable. But when we start talking about how we might use logging, we need to start looking at the security implications. So when we talk about our logging, we have to look at the sensitivity of the information that we're going after. And when we look at security and the information that we're retaining, we're not just looking at, I don't want to write out credit card numbers. We need to look at what is the physical security of getting to those logs. I've seen people in production environments write their log files to .text files, which then, IIS will serve. We need to look at who can see them, or look at how long those logs are being retained. And then, and only then, do we actually go look at the information that's included, right? Again, we don't want to be logging the password that they used that was incorrect. We don't want to be logging the credit card number that they used to make the transaction. And the idea behind this, though, is that it's a fine line. We need enough information to know what was going on or how they went through their application. But we need to make sure that we don't have too much information to create a privacy concern, or, especially for those of us that are needing to be compliant with other organizations' regulations, whether it be GDPR, HIPAA, or otherwise. We need to be really careful with the information that we're storing here. Now, what you do, how you secure it, what information you retain is really truly up to your specific implementation. If you want to offline, if you have specific questions, by all means, I'm willing to give you some guidance based on what we've experienced. But again, everybody's organization is going to be a little bit different. So we know the types of things we want to look at. We know the types of things that we're looking to be aware of when it comes to how we're writing these log entries. Now we need to take a look at, who do we tell? How do we take those logs and actually do something with them afterwards? And what I always like to say is the most important thing that you can do with your login is to put the information in the best possible place, but balance extremes from visibility and notification. Because if we get to an extreme amount of visibility or notifications, it's very easy to get into a situation where everybody ignores anything that comes out of the login system. My favorite, unfortunately, real example is a login system that sent an email for every single 404 that was received on a website. Now, as you can imagine, it probably didn't go so great, and it didn't, right? It was a site that was a newly redesigned website, so there was a lot of old pages, and the idea was, well, we might have missed some redirects. We want to be sure that we're aware of them. But there was no deduplication. There was nothing like that. It was literally one email per 404 message. Well, within about an hour of the site being launched, multiple people had already created filters for anything that came in from the login system, bypassed the inbox, bypassed other things, and went straight to the trash can. We essentially made it so that the logging system was no longer valid. It was no longer effective at doing its job. So we have to take a look at what we're doing and how we're escalating. And this is that first piece of the puzzle that pushes us to go beyond what we get out of the box from Microsoft. So what can we get from Microsoft with .NET Core for a destination for our log events? Well, out of the box from Microsoft, we can log to the console, we can log to application insights, we can log to the event source, which for those of us been around a while, right, we're talking about the Windows Event Viewer, or we can log to the debug window. Now, I don't know about you guys, but none of those are actually really valid things for me to do in production. App Insights is probably the closest because it's at least centralized and off of the server, but the reality of storage costs, ingestion costs, and extracting the data probably doesn't make sense for everyone to be able to use. So this is where we have to start looking at, well, what can we get from a third-party solution? Well, as we look at third-party, there are endless opportunities out there. We have file-based items, rolling file-based in terms of like a file per day, a file per hour, email, Azure storage, Azure tables, Azure table storage, you name it, there's most likely a destination out there. And the key here is that we might need more than one of these destinations in production. For example, we want to keep all of our logs to a certain severity level, regardless of if the system is performing good or bad. That gives us that historical trail. But then we also need to do an escalation process for the things that might be wrong. And this is where getting and putting something in place that can allow us to do a dynamic configuration becomes really critical. So if we look at my standard recommendation, the most common escalation pattern that I see is a dual configuration where we split based on severity. So errors. Errors are something that we want to obviously make sure they're still logged to the local file system so we can go back and look at them. So some sort of a file-based pattern, right? Easy, fast, human-friendly to read. But we also want to take those and send those somewhere else so that they can get distributed to somebody that cares. And this is the key. For me, I want those sent to an external service. I want an external service, something to be able to do the deduplication, to do the notifications. And at the end of the day, I don't want my application being bogged down by sending error emails or determining, oh my gosh, have I sent this error before? I don't know, let me go look, right? Leverage something else for that. There's all kinds of tools out there, literally hundreds of different tools that are out there to be able to do that kind of thing. The sole purpose for you is to figure out which one you want to go with. The secondary piece then is anything else that we care about, we log it locally to the file system and we just keep it around for 30 days, right? Or whatever retention period that you're looking for. And the idea here is we keep everything, but we take those things that we care more about and we send them somewhere so that we can escalate them. Whether that's an email escalation, whether that's an SMS message, whether that's going into your help desk system. I don't really care how you deal with them. The idea is that if an error happens in production, something that's truly logged as an error, it most likely is something that should be investigated, or maybe not, depending on your particular implementation. And that's where your usage of logging is going to determine a lot. Now, why do I like using the alert thresholds on an outside service? I really like the idea of being able to change my mind without changing the application. So in certain tools that exist, it's also possible to do an online adjustment of your logging levels. So say, for example, something weird happens in production, being able to ratchet that severity down and get more detailed messages for a little while, it's quite handy, right? And a lot of these tools can do that without having your application restart because it's shipping those log entries to another service, or that external service, right, can communicate with your application. Just depends on which tool you're using. So the idea here is to find a way to take and get that escalation process, but be as flexible as possible, with the primary goal being getting quick access to those detailed log messages, whether it's on the local file system of your application, some third-party tool, or otherwise. So all of this is great. What is unique about logging with .NET Core or .NET 6 or whatever version we want to call it at this point? The idea here is that there's a default configuration. It logs to the console. It logs a lot of detail. It hides a lot of things, but it's there, and most people ignore it. The true power, though, is in the logging stream. The concept that everything that you write out to the logging process, anything you'd write to the iLogger implementations, is a combination of everything. It's your messages, it's Microsoft's messages, it's Entity Framework's messages. If you use third-party libraries and they do logging, all of it's going to the same place so that you can get access to it. And the information that's available to you is huge. From a third-party perspective, this is where Serilog, in my opinion, and what I'm going to show you today, is a fantastic open source project to take that default configuration, has all of its limitations, and move yourself forward to truly enterprise grade support. And the idea here is we want to be able to get the benefits of all of this stuff being combined together. We want to be able to look at bottlenecks in Entity Framework, optimizations, things that maybe we didn't do right with our Entity Framework core model. And, you know, one of the best examples is if your application starts and you did something wrong, even if you're using migrations, the application may start and say, hey, this isn't as optimal as it could be. One of the best places to find it is to look in the log messages. You can log out query performance, the actual SQL queries. I don't know how many of you maybe utilize Entity Framework. You get into an argument with the DBA. That query isn't great. Well, guess what? With one configuration change, it is possible to go out and see exactly what Entity Framework is executing. And that allows you to do side-by-side comparisons between your application, Entity Framework, and what a DBA might actually be doing. So as we take this a couple of steps further, right, we can look at these login tools and start looking at things like, where do we want this information to go? And this is where those escalation protocols become kind of visible. This is an example of an escalation from a real production system of ours, utilizing SEQ, which is what we use for escalation. And you can see here that we get an error sent to our error reporting alias with the information about the error, including request method, request path, status code, time, all kinds of information to be able to be actionable and working within our application. We can then take that one step further and go look at the log entries that actually come out of all of our applications. In our case here, this is our centralized access across all of our client applications as well as our own internal stuff. And we can look at what's been going on. You can see here that, hey, somebody tried to access a disabled account. This user put in an invalid username. This user had some password issues. And notice here that we're doing as little as we can with confidential information. The only time that we really do anything here is like a username specifically, not necessarily the greatest thing, but we can continue to drill in to each of these pieces. Okay, the tooling that you use is going to determine a little bit of what you can see, what you can do. But the idea is this is where we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to, I'm not reading a big ugly log file. I'm not trying to do, anything one-off. I'm trying to get the information in a structured manner and then analyzing it with other tools. And then I can do the kinds of things that I need to look at it. Now, I do like to call attention to one thing that is often misunderstood when it comes to the message format or message process when writing out a log message. The default behavior of writing out a log message in .NET or anything that you're doing here is that you utilize a message template. So in other words, log information. My message template is user information. Oh, and this is a piece of information that I'm providing later. Think of it as a params list. Notice this isn't an interpolated string, right? There's no $ here. But the idea is that, oh, user information, oh, I want to call this user. Depending on the downstream tools that you use, it's able to extract this name. So rather than it being curly brace, 0 curly brace, it's, oh, this is the user or whatever the case may be. This default behavior calls ToString on whatever is put in here. So you're not really running much of a security concern, right? Unless you put like password in there or whatever the case may be. But what you get with this error message or with this log, for example, is a timestamp. I'll talk about this correlation ID in a second. Information. Oh, user information, Microsoft ASP.NET Core, blah, blah, blah. Oh, well, that's not very helpful, but that's expected. We didn't get anything more than what we were expecting. There is a syntax difference, though, where you can tell the logger process that you want it to dump out the object as a JSON representation rather than calling ToString. And this is an incredibly powerful thing, but something that I really, really encourage folks to make sure you're validating for in your code reviews. A lot of the third-party tools for static code analysis, things like SonarQube or Veracode, you name it, they're actually looking and setting up warnings when you have log messages with templates that look like this, because what this is going to do is whatever is provided for this particular parameter, it is going to attempt to do a full JSON dump of that object. So as you can imagine here, with me doing user.identity, you're going to get everything for that user identity. In my case, I just gave a snippet of what this looks like for somebody that isn't logged in. If you are logged into the application, you're going to get substantially more information. And this puts you into a situation where you may be able to get access to information or maybe logging information that really truly shouldn't be logged. And that's one of the things we try to avoid, is anything that might get us into that situation where we aren't able to keep track of everything. So I'm going to put a couple links up here. I will bring this back up in just a little bit. I want to get into the source code demos, but I want to provide a couple of links here. The GitHub repository link, this is the link to my repository that has this presentation, the source code in it. The EF Core login details, this is a direct link into the Microsoft documentation that shows you what Microsoft has to say about logging with Entity Framework Core. What can you get from it? What kinds of information is available? Serilog, this is a link to a number of the Serilog extensions, which we'll talk about here in just a second as I get into the code samples. And then SEQ is the paid for tool that we utilize for log aggregation and escalation. Obviously, there are other tools out there. I'm just simply showing what we use. There is no, you do not have to use SEQ if you use Serilog. You can use any number of other tools. So just keep that in mind, just simply showing you what I use, what's worked well for me over the years. So with that being said, I'm going to pause sharing here for just 1 second to switch over to a different window so I can show you the web project that I have created for the demos. Again, this entire source code repository is available on GitHub. You can run it locally. The biggest thing is if you want to run it locally and you want to see the entity framework examples, make sure to go into the app settings JSON file and update the connection string to point to an empty database that can actually get access to. Other than that, the example, the example will run without that database connection. It's just that if you try to access anything, like try to log in, try to register and create an account, it's not going to do anything. The project itself is nothing more than the standard MVC template from Microsoft, and then I've simply enhanced it with a number of different example scenarios. So if we factor out the configuration for a second and we just talk about using logging somewhere within your application code, once logging is properly configured, you can simply inject an iLogger of whatever type you're currently in your constructor, and then you can write out your log messages. So as you can see here, I have a method called trigger warning. If you go out to that view, it actually writes a warning message. The complex method, complex logging example, it writes out two of the kind of examples of what was in the slides just a second ago. In the privacy section, it's just an action to show a little bit about privacy. Entity framework is simply showing you a detail. And then we have an example here of writing, an error message out. Obviously, you want to put more detail in here. But the idea is you can include this anywhere within your solutions and be able to do things in a normal fashion. If we look at the default Microsoft configuration, you had this bit in your app settings JSON. Login, log level. Okay, default was debug. System is informational. Microsoft is information. Again, where is it going? What is it doing? How is that being done? Well, at the end of the day, it's very, very hard to try to get an idea of exactly where that configuration is going. So this example, if we look at the actual project file itself, I have included a couple of NuGet packages. I've included Serilog ASP.NET Core, which is Serilog's integration with ASP.NET. I've included a Serilog Enrichers correlation ID. Now, this is something that is really cool with the extensibility of the login platform. What this does is it creates a correlation ID which is unique for every web request, so that every log entry for that particular web request has the same correlation ID. So think of it as simply a GUID generator that is applied to each of your web requests, so that if you wanted to follow all of the log entries for a particular web request, you can do so by filtering on that correlation ID. We then also include the Serilog settings configuration NuGet package. This is what allows Serilog to load its configuration settings from a JSON configuration. The last two here are actually no longer necessary. I'll update the code sample here to be able to do it. The ASP.NET Core one automatically brings these two down. But the idea is to be able to write a sync is a destination. So syncs console, syncs file, that is to write to the console, to the file system. There's all kinds of other syncs out there. Feel free to look those up on GitHub. You'll see there's syncs that even take it out to Log4net, which is another logging framework. So you can really, truly take those entries and push them wherever you want. And what this does is this allows us to build a configuration that is far more descriptive of what we want to do with our login. So we no longer use that Microsoft login configuration at all, and we have a Serilog configuration. In the Serilog configuration, I like to look at it as having 4 parts at minimum. You may have more, but we have 4 at minimum. First, we have a using, which simply tells Serilog, hey, I'm going to use these particular components. This is nothing more than telling Serilog to do a double check that the right assets are included in the application. We then set up our minimum levels. This is one of the areas that I think is important for folks to understand. Our minimum level simply says, what level does the system start to care about the log entries that come out? So in our case here, we have the default level set to debug. This is important to understand because if I set this to something higher, if I set my default to be information, right? And the order of the hierarchy of log entries, right, is debug, information, warning, error. If I set this to be information, it is not possible for me to do an override to become even more granular. So the default applies to every single log message, no matter what. Overrides then can ratchet that to a higher level. So in other words, default says we want debug, information, warning, and errors. We're saying as an override, oh, anything that comes from Microsoft, which is based on namespace, and it's a partial match. So this is anything Microsoft namespace. Oh, I only want information. Anything system related, I only want warning or errors. But I do a different override here, and this would be if I did this, right? So Microsoft warning, system warning. Then I can do, oh, Microsoft Entity Framework Core database command. I want that information. And what this does is it tells Entity Framework Core's log messages around database commands that were executed that we want to make sure that we get those included. Enriching is the way that we tell Serilog, hey, I want you to do a couple other things. Log context allows you to inject other things into the log context, which I'll show you in a second. The machine name, the thread ID, and then that correlation ID. So this is telling Serilog all of the things you want it to add to. And then lastly, we have the write to, which tells Serilog where should these log entries go that meet the minimum level criteria. And in this case, we have 2 write tos. The first one is console with no other configuration. And then we have file, which has some additional arguments to it. So if you notice here, it has a path of logs, my log.txt. Conveniently, you see my log file here, restricted to minimum level information. So this is where I'm simply saying, hey, you know what? My default is debug, and that goes to the console. But the only things that want to go to the file system are information or higher severity. So this is where you can start to do those segments of severity-based logging. And then we have an output template, which just determines what it looks like on the file system. And that is the overall general configuration. What this results in then is a log file that looks like this. And the thing I want to start with, just looking at one example, this is one of those entries that comes out of Entity Framework. So we can see our timestamp, our correlation ID, executed DB command. It took 63 milliseconds. It had a parameter of normalized username. It was a text-based command. It had a timeout of 30 seconds. And then here's my actual SQL that was executed. Notice though that it's only got my parameters. This is the default configuration without telling Entity Framework that you want to log anything else. You can have it log sensitive information, i.e. the parameter values that were passed. I strongly discourage you from ever doing that. But it is something that you can do if you absolutely need to, and the documentation to do that process is there. Now, this gives you that overall configuration. So how do we wire this up? How do we make sure that our application gets this information? Well, we can do it the really simple way, but what I have in this example is the most robust configuration process that allows you to properly track any error that might happen from the second that your application starts until the application ends. And the way that we do that is before our application fully starts, before we go out and create our web host builder or anything else, we build our own configuration instance, configure logging, and then start our application. So the only thing that could ever result in your app crashing without a log message or a log error being created is if you have an error in these first 5 lines of code. So what we do here is in program CS, we create a static configuration. It's a new configuration builder where our base path is set. We add our app settings JSON file. I add environment variables because we may want to override things with an environment variable. And then we build that configuration. Then the first thing we do in main is we actually configure Serilog out of the gate. So we do a new logger configuration reading from configuration, which is our configuration up here. We technically could even probably make this not a static if we really wanted to. The biggest reason why we did this is so that if we wanted to be able to do reload on change, etc., we can. Once we've done this, then inside of a try catch, we go and actually start our application. And notice here we do create web host builder. We tell the web host builder that we're also using Serilog. There's a couple of other ways to be able to do this, and that's why we're getting a little bit of an error. They changed a couple of things, or a warning. It still works. But the idea here is then we tell the web host builder we want to use Serilog, which ensures that everything is wired up, and then we use startup. And with this, our logger has been configured, so any log entries inside a startup are actually going to be done. Startup fails, we catch the exception, we log that exception, and then our finally block makes sure that that log gets closed and flushed out before the application completely shuts down. So this makes it so that we can then get the best overall collection of information. The only other piece that we get with Serilog where we can make things a little bit nicer for us is the concept of being able to enrich our log context with other pieces of information. So I talked about the correlation ID, and you can kind of see here, right? The correlation ID shows you that, oh gosh, these 4 log messages, right, all came from the same process. Well, we can take that information, sorry, these 3, helps if I highlight the right ones. So what we can do is we can control this, and inside of our startup, we can say, hey, we want to use Serilog request logging, which the Serilog request logging helps us with some simplified aggregate stuff, but then we can enrich that diagnostic context with additional information. So I can inject the requesting user, and it's just always going to be there as part of that log context. I could inject the request IP address or other bits of information. And the idea here is that you're controlling that diagnostic context and you're inserting whatever information that you might want into that process. Now, what's really key here is I've done this after use static files because I don't really care about every JPEG or every text file or every JavaScript file that was downloaded. So just like everything else, it is a matter of where we insert this as to whether or not it's going to be controlled and doing the things that we want it to be doing. So the idea here is we set up our configuration to get those log entries done, and then we update our code to have whatever custom errors that we need, but then we can also control what information we get out of Microsoft or otherwise. And what I always like to show people is if I come in here and just simply start the application with Microsoft at information as well as system, what kinds of information actually get logged when your application starts? So I'm just going to simply start the application. I'm going to let the index page come up, and then I'm going to go to two separate pages just to avoid you guys having to flip back and forth. If I go look at the logs, there we go. If I look at the logs, now we see a lot of information. And you can see here, starting web host user profile is available. Not sure if this has ever happened to somebody, but if you've ever had issues with the data protection keys, this actually is a log entry that comes out of ASP.NET that says, hey, this is where the data protection keys are going to be stored, and Windows is going to be used to encrypt them at rest. And then it says, hey, you know what? I'm not going to be able to do this part of setup, so it's an error out of Kestrel. And then we see a whole bunch of other information with our individual requests. And this is where I think it's really powerful for you to see the exact extent of information that's available, even though we may not want to see it. So for example, all of these entries were the initial response to get the index page loaded. So you can see here, request started, identity was not authenticated, unprotected ticket, executing this endpoint. Oh, that's what we're executing. Oh, I matched this route with this metadata. I executed this action, or I'm executing, i.e. starting to execute. I've executed. Now I'm executing the view result. Now I executed the view result. And notice we have performance specs in here. This is how long it took to run. Executed this action, meaning the whole action is completed. So this one and this one match with each other. Executed endpoint, HTTP GET responded, and then this is the amount of time. Then we can see here, these are all of the other things. Oh, we got the full response. Oh, now we've got the CSS file, the JS bundle, the CSS, the JS. You can see all of those things. Here's other things that were necessary as you do the individual things, and then you can see my next web request here. So the idea is we have a lot of information. We have a lot of ways to be able to ramp up or ramp down that granularity so that we can determine what our application needs to do or might not need to do. And this is a way for us to be able to get insight into what's Microsoft doing. If you have issues figuring out why a custom route isn't working, if you have issues with binding, model binding, other things, oftentimes you're going to be able to get some information from this process that's going to allow you to do something more importantly, whether it be in production or whether it be somewhere else. So with that, again, I've got the web application is out here. The key here is in the two configuration bits in program and startup. Everything else you can kind of navigate and look at the examples, look at the log files as they get generated on your machine. Try to run the application without updating the connection string. You'll see the kinds of error messages that get reported by ASP.NET and Entity Framework. So I'll open up here if there's questions. Make sure to get those questions into the Q&A section. I think that'll be the easiest way to do it. I'm going to put the links back up here in the share just so that everybody can see those. And again, I think I'll drop a link to the repository here in chat as well, just to try to make it a little bit easier for folks to get a hold of.
So far, we've got a pretty quiet group, but if anyone has any questions, definitely get those in. I can, from my side, I can also just give a +1 to both Seek and Serilog. They're both pretty fantastic tools and a tool in a library, so highly recommended for those. Serilog especially just is a big improvement over a lot of other logging frameworks that I've used in the past. So definitely love it, especially as you get more into things like structured logging and that sort of thing.
It combined with SCQ, right, is really the big thing. And for me, one of the things, I mean, the real pitch on Serilog and SCQ for those that are potentially researching tools. Serilog is amazing. It's open source, and Nicholas does an amazing job of supporting everything. SCQ is a paid for product. It's a way for, I look at it as a way to help give back to all of that open source amazingness, in addition to sponsored or otherwise. Just giving his product a nod, I think, is something to really help, because it doesn't matter if you use that product or not. You can still use Serilog for all of the other tools, but it's definitely something that you know, it's better than everything else, and the price point's right. But again, you can use anything you want.
Cool. Yeah, and I saw LJ added a comment that probably sums up how a lot of other folks are feeling. Of there was a lot there still digesting. Very cool. So it's a lot to take in, but it's definitely some fundamentals.
Yeah, and please don't hesitate. I mean, this is the whole thing with this is it's there's so many things that people don't necessarily think about. My contact information's here as well. Reach out. I'm always open to answering questions and sharing what we've seen. So you know, don't hesitate to reach out after this, next week, next month, next year. I'll gladly point you in the direction of the resources that we've had. You know, I've blogged about things where I just need to make sure I remember how all of this was put together. So I created a blog about it. I mean, that's where a lot of that stuff comes from. So really appreciate everybody's tonight, but looks like I got Greg. I'll kind of hand it back over to you.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll ramble for a few more seconds, give folks you know, last chance to get any last minute questions in. But really just want to say you know, huge thank you to Mitchel. Like I said, this is the sort of content that's near and dear to my heart, so I love it. But I think it's you know, like I said, a really great set of fundamentals that are worth, you know, learning and understanding and leveraging. Like I use this stuff every day to debug applications and understand the health of systems in production and all that. So highly recommended. Huge thanks for giving that session. Also, you know, another thanks again for Kelvin for that awesome Metalama demo at the top. Like I said earlier, the video of this will be up on our YouTube channel probably somewhere in the next week or so. I have a little trip coming up, so I'll see what I can squeeze in. But I'll, you know, put an announcement out there on Twitter and our meetup page and Slack and all the normal places to let you know when that's up. But you know, thanks again for everyone for coming. It really is it's a privilege to be able to run these things every month and be able to you know, still engage with the community, even though we're not all always in the same place anymore. So Really, really appreciate it. Thanks again. Hope to see you soon at our next upcoming meetings. And until then, stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you soon. Have a great night, folks.